Recently, somebody shared with me a secret local legend about a ghost town that it's at the end of some dusty road up here in western South Dakota, out in the Black Hills, that is called Galena. And this little town popped up in the 1870s when a colorful cast of characters came west, hoping to find their fortunes in the form of gold. Well, all of that's super interesting, but then this person goes on to tell me what for me is the real hook. Apparently, these old-timers went out, and one of the first things they did with the resources they got out of the ground was spend money and time to build a couple of churches. That's interesting. Because when you think about the Old West, you think about the saloon fights and the brothels and the showdowns in the street and the sheriff and all of that business. But what about going to church? What was that like in that environment? And then it occurred to me, I live right by this. I could just go look. So I got in the truck, I grabbed that camera right there. My buddy Aron came along with me, and we went up, we found the town and set out on a very simple quest to go find and touch physical evidence of a ghost town church and learn about what it might have been like to be a part of that congregation. We go out and we bump along down this twisty mountain road, and we find ourselves in a long, narrow gulch that was once the site of the bustling Wild West boom town of Galena. And there were still signs of what the old timers left behind, but for the most part, it just looked like a normal but pretty wooded country road with a few homes scattered along it. And we searched around fruitlessly until we ran into a longtime local named Jeff. He and I had never met, but when I told him we were looking for church ruins and trying to get a sense of the kind of people who might have attended a church like that, he dropped everything he was working on and said the place to start, if you're looking for something like that, would be up at the cemetery. He said nobody remembers the names of most of the people who are buried here, which I thought was kind of sad. But he pointed out the graves of 3 people, whose names we do know, who he thought might have darkened the door of the church back in frontier times. And this first fellow,
I think he's the one that fell off a cliff. Yeah. Working on the mine. He was dropping ore over the cliff, and he went with it.
The story behind this next grave had legit Wild West cred.
Okay. Gorman is drunk, seemingly, and he starts pushing and maybe going to hit Frank. Frank pulls out his gun. Gorman takes the gun. Billy Thatcher shoots Gorman. That's the end of that. So that's one of the only gunfights in town.
This more elaborate grave is the pride of Galena. It's the resting place of Sarah Campbell, who went by the nickname Aunt Sally. She was born a slave, but then she cleverly won her freedom in the Dakota Territory and then attached herself to Lieutenant Colonel George Armstrong Custer on his expedition to the Black Hills in 1874. And then she chose to stay here in Galena while Custer rode on to meet his fate at the Battle of the Little Bighorn a short time after they parted ways. She's officially the first non-native woman to come to the Black Hills. When I set out on this adventure chasing down this local legend, I did not expect to find myself going for a pleasant leisurely stroll through the woods with Jeff, but I found myself doing so because he said he was pretty sure he knew the site of one of the original now gone churches, and he agreed to show me where it was.
Where that little bitty White House shed or whatever it is, that's where the church was.
What a lovely accessible spot they had.
Yeah. St. Basil.
I'm not ashamed to admit that I felt some nervous excitement at the prospect of finding some evidence of a gold rush boomtown church as we dropped down the hills, but the site was initially disappointing.
I'm not seeing any kind of foundation here. Well, here's a stone. That might just be nothing. That might be part of the foundation of an old 1800s church. What is this? Oh, check this out. I bet a whole bunch of miners received communion off of this slab right here.
Jeff thought they had some antique pictures of Galena in the old schoolhouse, so he went and opened that up for us. And sure enough, I got a good look at St. Basil's Church, which is beautiful in its heyday. And seeing it in the context of its surroundings, I would say those partially buried stones we just found are sitting in probably the right place to have been the foundation of that particular church. But while we were in there looking at pictures, I found another physical remnant from Galena's frontier churches that had been relocated to a corner of the schoolhouse. This is a foot pump powered organ. And these were the instruments of choice for small American congregations from like the 1850s to the 1920s. And I'm glad we found this because seeing this here makes it easier to imagine what church in Galena would have sounded like back in the day. Don't get me wrong, it was cool to find what looks like it might have been foundation stones to an old Catholic church. It was really cool to find that slab that is probably the altar, maybe repurposed as a gravestone, I don't know. But I wanted something more. I was hoping to actually get to put my hands on the remains of an actual church and to be able to picture what a Wild West mining town frontier church attended by the colorful characters that we met over in the cemetery. I wanted to picture what that would be like. Well, Jeff hinted that we shouldn't give up just yet, and then he went off into the woods and invited us to follow.
Okay, anyway, so it's not like the day where you have a pastor who's at this church and this is his church. It's not like that back then. It was more somebody in Sturgis hears a preacher that they like, so they invite him out to preach. Okay, and they come out, and if they like him, they give him a good offering and invite him back.
Oh, so you just use the daily offering to support the guy.
Yeah, and then the next week it'd be a guy from Hill City or something, you know, who knows.
Sure.
There should be a trail.
Jeff, this is intense. I love it.
Okay, here's your steeple.
Oh, look at this. That is spectacular. It's just incredible to me that people came to the far ends of the earth at their time to get some money out of the ground. And one of the first things they wanted to do was build a church. And rather than making it some little dump, they felt compelled to do something of this scale.
Yeah, you should be able to see the foundation of the building too, I think. Okay. So you could follow the foundation if you wanted. It was pretty big. This could have been the front.
So this was your entrance.
Yeah.
And you come through here. Did you ever go to church here?
No. It was all long gone when I was a kid.
Did you ever meet anybody who went to church here?
My mom. She remembers going to a box social here, but that's it.
So you come in here, they got a steeple. They have a bell up there probably?
Yeah.
I bet that sounded amazing going through this gulch. This is the one edge of the building. That's the other edge of the building. I think I've got this figured out in terms of the layout. All right, this piece of old mining tin that I'm standing over here would mark what I think would be the platform. I think I'm standing where one of those traveling ministers would conduct the services. Just use your imagination a little bit to try and picture what it was like to come to church here in the 1800s. And you got to figure these trees right here would have been totally cleared out so you could see all the way across the gulch, clear up there to that peak, to these peaks over here. And the spring and the summer, you get this mist that appears on the bottom of these gulches right along the creek. Everybody comes out of the mines, scrubs off the dirt for one day to look sharp. They come through town and up that steep hill that I just walked up, and in the front door, that steeple bell is ringing. They probably don't know the minister who's standing up front because it's just going to be whoever was available to preach at a given time, and probably they had several weeks at a time where they didn't have anybody because nobody was in town. And so maybe they didn't have church that week, which made it maybe even more of a privilege when you actually got to worship together and think about the text together in a formal sense. They moved to the middle of nowhere to an environment that was trying to murder them. They had very few resources, and they spent their energy right from the get-go putting something like this in place. Legit ghost town church.
I heard a local legend about a ghost town church. I went out into the woods, and thanks pretty much entirely to the generosity of a friendly local, I got to find said ghost town church. I got to stand in the place where people went to church and learned about God and sang songs and did faith and probably had uncomfortable meetings and butted heads and disagreed with each other too. I got to stand in the place where all of that normal life of the church happened. I got to put my hands on the building that they put so much energy into getting up in the first place and to maintaining through the decades. And I got to feel a sense of connection to a bunch of Christians, many of whom are buried in that cemetery, and there's not even names on the grave markers for them anymore because they're forgotten. But we have this shared belief. We're a part of this shared family, this shared story that transcends time and death. And so it's pretty cool that I got to be where they went to church, even if that's not a place where church happens anymore. But at the same time, look, if you go and stand in a place like that is being eaten by trees, it's going to take you to the thinky place. And it gets me thinking about where I go to church, the building that is. It gets me thinking about all of the other buildings and structures that provide some sense of stability and consistency in my life. And I can't help but realize that every single one of those places where I hang out, where you hang out right now, all of those places that give us a sense of meaning and stability, they're all going to get eaten by trees too. Like, what's the legacy of that little church in the woods being eaten by trees? Well, you just watch this video, so it gets a little bonus legacy out of that. If you're thinking with me about any of this stuff, hey, that's because of the testimony of what these people did in the woods way back in the day. That's interesting. But also, there were probably a bunch of rough and tumble people who went to church there, outsiders who were Christians there. These were the kind of people a Wild West town drew. And they knew people, and they did things, and they had kids, and they shaped stuff. And we might not be able to directly trace every positive effect that came out of what happened at that church right back to it, but it happened. I think it's perfectly natural to go to a place like that and to feel sobered, even to feel a little bit of grief at just the nature of life and time and how it affects us. But I also think it's completely natural to go and see something like that and to think about, okay, well, what am I going to do with the time that I have? What am I going to do with the opportunities that I have, whether it be in my relationships with others, with the world in general, or in my relationship with God and in relationship to the biggest questions that everybody wrestles with about life, death, and eternity. Thanks for watching this. I know this is a little different than what we normally do, and thanks also for being willing to go to the thinky place with me. If you like internet like this, I'd be grateful if you'd consider subscribing. If not, no big deal at all. Either way, thanks for hanging out with me. I'm Matt. This is the 10-Minute Bible Hour. Let's do this again soon.